Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofrumento, and I'm joined by an awesome guest here today who does really deep and meaningful work with all different types of businesses. And it focuses on the most important ingredient of every business, which is the people behind it. So I'm so excited to tell you about today's guest. His name is Glenn Akramoff. He is the founder and CEO of Akramoff LLC. His expertise is rehabilitating and revitalizing municipal government workplaces and has developed a program that will improve any organization by returning humanity to the center of focus. When looking into Glenn's work, I've really loved going through all the stuff that his business stands for, what he stands for, all the improvements that he's able to make inside of organizations, because you'll see it right on his website, which we're going to talk about today. The headline there is Reimagining Workplaces, and Glenn is the first person I've seen that really focuses in his messaging focuses on human maximization. So there's going to be tips, strategies, lessons, perspectives that are going to change the way that we view our own work, our own teams, and the way that we interact with others. So I'm not going to say anything else. Let's dive straight into my interview with Glenn Akramoff. All right, Glenn, I'm so excited that you're here. So much that we get to dive into today. Welcome to the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Heck yeah. So I told listeners a little bit about you, and I'm obviously particularly excited about certain parts of your work, but listeners always love hearing the stories from the guests themselves. So give us your short story. How the heck did you get into all the amazing things that you're up to today that's given you all these perspectives and insights for organizations?
Well, I actually started as a frontline worker in local government, actually in my hometown, and I just worked my way through the ranks over the years, and actually worked my way to be a city manager eventually. And so along the way, I saw a lot of wonderful people and a lot of struggles in organizations, and in government it can be challenging because there's high expectations, as there should be. So I noticed these things. I noticed I could actually have some influence on people and influence on organizations and the culture. And then I started to realize I had some leadership ability, moved to being a leader, and started implementing things and creating this program. Like my son says, it's kind of my life's work, and I created it through experiences and seeing problems and trying to solve them. And I certainly had some really good friends. What really motivates me is I had some really good friends who struggled because of toxic workplaces, and a couple of them didn't make it. And so that motivates me to make sure that everybody who we can have make it can. So that's kind of my why and what got me into it.
Yeah, I love that overview, especially because it's something we see from so many entrepreneurs, which is we have a tendency to scratch our own itches. It's something that you firsthand experienced. And heck, entrepreneurs at our very foundational level, we are problem solvers. So right off the bat, hearing the fact that you were in your job and you saw those problems, and Glenn, I'm sure that now at this point in your career, you've seen it across so many different types of businesses, inside and outside of government, which government does introduce its own complexities, bureaucracies, so many different components there. But walk us through some of those problems that you did start to notice, and what was your thought process back then, transitioning from an employee who you were part of the system, so to speak, like you were part of the internal culture. I always say you can't read the label from inside the jar. You were inside the jar for a little bit, but it sounds like you started seeing these problems even while you were in there.
Yes, most definitely. I think the biggest one was that the culture wasn't healthy, and people couldn't find their way to help, and the organizations weren't set up to do that. And I realized that people are people, and they do what they do, and they have motivations behind it, sometimes not totally fixed or understood by themselves. And I realized a lot of leaders, especially frontline, the first level leaders, weren't prepared. I was lucky enough to work with one who was, and right off the bat, and he was put in there because things were struggling, and he was a really good mentor to me. And one of the things that he told me was I had a really good instinct for people, much better than he had. And this is a guy who'd been doing it for 25 years. So I realized that, having an instinct and going with your instincts is important. The other problems that I found were people had lost their sense of purpose, and they were, or hadn't even found them. And I know there's that's a buzzword nowadays, and I totally understand that. But when the organization's not clear on its purpose, and the human that is working in it isn't clear on theirs, you have a lot of miscommunications and a lot of frustration. And long-term frustration and a toxic workplace creates people trying to figure out how to manage that. Some leave, some don't feel they can leave, some self-medicate. And then that causes all kinds of problems in life. And I've watched that happen on a regular basis. And so all I did was get really curious and try to figure out why, and did a lot of research, a lot of studying, took a lot of classes, and I couldn't get the answers. So I started figuring out how I could create the answers.
Yeah, Glenn, you're bringing up so many uniquely human ingredients and characteristics now, curiosity chief among them. And what I'm super curious about is, in your pursuit of finding these answers and following that curiosity, you brought up really early on in that past answer about understanding human motivations. What topic is more complex than that? But it's also crazy because what topic plays more into why we do things, how we fit into things, how we view the work that we all do, whether we're part of a team, whether we're growing our own business. Human motivation is such a complex thing. Talk to us about some of those things that you found there, because it is an essential part of understanding how to get a team to move in the same direction, as motivations are at the root of it. But what were some of those answers and insights that you started finding there?
Well, the challenge that a lot of people have is, especially in government, and especially when I started, government is perceived as a good job. It has good benefits. It has steady work, which is why a lot of us got into it. It does have a great purpose in that you get to serve other human beings, but I think that's why people get into it. There are a lot of people that aren't matched and aren't working through their jobs. They're motivated by the money and the steady and the fact that people tell them they should respect that and like that. But a lot of times they didn't. They didn't like the work. They hated the job. They hated the organization, not because it was bad, but it just wasn't a good fit for them. And so that's one of the things we find in our work every time, is there are a number of people, 10 to 15%, who are totally mismatched in their work. And they haven't really thought about it, or they're frustrated by it. So again, that is the big thing. I also encourage leaders to think about that. Why is someone struggling? Yes, they're going to voice it in a negative way, or maybe they're negative about the workplace. Why? And usually the answer is they're either mismatched in their job, or they're not using the skill set that they have. And so I believe in creating building the job around the human being that's in it. And when you look at the most successful people in successful organizations, that's what has happened through history.
Yeah, Glenn, it's almost interesting hearing the way that you talk about these own experiences that you've had in being inside of different organizations. Part of me wonders how much of this work is proactive versus reactive. Obviously, there's essential things we have to do on both sides of that coin. But as someone who runs my own businesses and has team members that I hire, in my head, I would like to pretend, well, Glenn, let's set me up for success by proactively getting on top of all this stuff. But that's not always reality. There are things that we have to also be reactive to. How much of your work considers both sides of those coins, and what are some of the answers and insights you found on both of those?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It takes both. And so to set up yourself so you can be successfully reactive, you do need to be proactive. You need to know your people. You need to know what triggers them to be motivated and demotivated. And then you watch for those things. That's the proactive part going into the reactive. And life happens to people, right? Things happen in their lives that are in your team or outside that impact them. And as a leader and as a leader of a team, you need to know what those things are. Again, in today's world, people don't have to be very specific. And really, you don't need them to. You just need to know they're struggling a little bit. And you can see it. If you get to know your people, even the ones who think they can hide it really well, really can't hide it. And so that is, to me, that's the dynamic of the proactive versus reactive. Do everything you can, set up everybody for success, but then know what triggers them. And then when you see them react, then you react. You can't wait. I think that's the mistake most leaders make is, well, they'll work it out. Well, maybe they will, but sometimes they just need acknowledgement that someone paid attention. And the power of a leader is really important in that dynamic.
Yeah, I want to push more into that topic because it's fun talking to you here today because I'm not only talking to Glenn the entrepreneur, Glenn the leader, Glenn the person who's been a team member inside of different organizations yourself, but with your leadership hat on, there are so many roles as business leaders that we all have to play. And it's that in and of itself, again, we're coming up to all of these complex topics that I think that so much of your work aims to simplify and aims to make actionable for us in our daily lives. What is the role of a leader in your place? Because obviously leader, to a certain degree, the actual word says that, there are followers there. We are leading someone or something, whether it's a ship, a business, some people, whatever that leadership role may be. In your opinion, what are the most successful leaders? What is that trait? What is the role that they're fulfilling?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, like you said, a lot of stuff is complex. I think a great leader knows who they are and knows who they're not, and is willing to sacrifice for the team and model behaviors that do that so the team can be successful. So it doesn't really matter where you are in the organization. It doesn't matter what your title is. And a lot of people say that in a general way, but it is true. I would say one of the first time that I realized that I was ready to move to the next level, I was a maintenance worker and I was leading a team of seasonal maintenance workers. And one of the things I hated to do was flag, right? I didn't want to flag people traffic, but on that team, I stepped up and said, okay, I'm going to flag. I want you guys to, do this and do that. And they did the work. And I didn't feel bad about it. I wasn't upset about it. I chose to do it. And I realized the team needed me to do that so they could grow. I was willing to do it so they could grow. And I realized that I had become a leader. And I had no position. I was a maintenance worker. But I think that's the dynamic that really starts you down the leadership. And I cared about my people. I wanted them to succeed. And I wanted us to succeed as a team. And I was willing to do whatever it took. And I think that's what leaders do. And it doesn't matter whether your title is maintenance worker or CEO. Those are what good ones do.
Yes, I love the fact that you called that out, Glenn. So many of our listeners, they are entrepreneurs, but a heck of a lot of our listeners are also in that wantrepreneur phase. Maybe they still have their 9-to-5 job. And listeners, this is Glenn's invitation directly to you, regardless of your title, regardless of any formal labels. All of us can step up and be that leader. And you heard some of those ingredients from Glenn right there. Part of it is truly caring about the people around you. And these are traits that are going to follow you into your entrepreneurial journey. Glenn, I want to talk about, I'm a big fan of frameworks, and that's why part of your work, we talk about complexities, but what I really admire and appreciate about your work is that you've taken the time to be strategic and intentional in studying and analyzing the landscape of these topics. And one framework that you have that I love, listeners, this is all on Glenn's website. You can see it afterwards. We're going to talk about it. It's going to be linked down below, but I love your 6 pillars of workplace health. And up to this point, we've been talking about culture, for example. That's one of your 6 pillars. But you also have structure, systems, processes, external forces, performance analysis. Talk to us about all of these different pillars, and even at a broader level. I can't wait to hear your perspectives on what does workplace health mean? Because a lot of people want to just dismissively say, yeah, of course my workplace is healthy, but what does it actually mean from your perspective?
Right. Okay. Well, let me talk about the pillars first. The culture, of course, is one of the key pillars, but we have 6 for a reason. And everything starts with culture. Everybody says that, but I don't see a lot of people living it. And if you, in your company, if you're not, please do. It is incredibly important, especially in today's world. I don't have to explain too much about that one. Structure is interesting because that's the next one, and it directly impacts culture. You know, who's leading the who, and what is everybody's role, and how is that defined? And most structures are organically grown, especially as an entrepreneur. As your company grows, you grow, you fill in the positions with great people, and you build the jobs around them if you're doing it right. And then you get to a point where it's too flat, or it's, you just have to reevaluate it and be diligent about it. The next one is processes, where that's how you do your work. That's the steps you take to do your work. A lot of people don't document them and teach them inconsistently, so that impacts your customer experience for sure, but also your employee experience. That's where a lot of conflict happens, actually, is on how people do their work. So processes are very important. The next one is systems. What tools you use. We include in our processes of evaluating things. We also include your building, your vehicles, but also your software, your hardware. All of those things are your systems you use to do your work. Amazing how human beings can find workarounds and then be tied to their workarounds. And then there's external forces, which are the things that impact your company or your business or your team, but you have no control over. Inflation is a perfect one right in today's world. And then the last one is analytics. We like to count a lot. So are you counting the most important things? And is that telling you whether you're successful or not? So then how does that relate to workplace health? Well, one of the things that I noticed is that when all of those things are aligned and all those pillars are in place, people are happier. People are able to function and fulfill their roles, which makes them feel fulfilled. Leaders are less stressed because they're able to do the things they are because their team's empowered to do their work. And so things run smoothly. You provide better products. Your customers feel that you're being successful, so they treat you successfully. I call it, if you act like a champion and behave like one, you'll be treated like one. And that's where those 6 pillars really come in. That improves. People don't self-medicate. People will be able to go get help and recognize that they need help, both mentally, physically, and emotionally. And so it just makes for a very healthy human being and a healthy team, and that makes a healthy company.
Yeah, I love that, especially because I'm thinking back a few months ago, we had an incredible neuropsychologist on the show. Her name is Dr. Cerny Walazonia. And one point that she made is burnout doesn't stop at the office door. If you're burned out in your work, that's going to follow you into your daily life, and vice versa. The doorway to our offices is not some magical portal where these things leave us. And Glenn, I love the fact that your work focuses on healthy, like you mean the word healthy, and you just said it right there. Mentally, physically, spiritually, all of those things contribute to our health, not only as employees, but healthy people become healthy employees. Healthy people are healthy employees. So, it's right there on your website, a quote from you: we're not teaching people just to be productive, but to be productive with a purpose. I want to talk about that purpose part, because going back to how we talked about everyone has their own motivations for a million different reasons. And you brought up one of your 6 6 pillars is we love to count things. We love measurements. Obviously, KPIs are an important part of the business world. What sort of things are you looking for to unite all these different individuals as, hey, this is our North Star. This is the thing that we measure or the things that we measure. Here's what we're striving towards. Give us some examples of those.
Sure. Well, I think that you mentioned purpose, and a company has to have a purpose that is meaningful to everybody, and it has to align with the individual's purpose. And again, like you said, we all have different ways to reflect that and to look at that. But in order, and it can't be just making money. It can't be the bottom line. While that's important in most businesses, and for many in the business, that is an important thing that you do count, right? Is your profitability. It has to have a little bit more meaning to get there. So usually that is almost every business that I know of serves human beings in some way. So measuring how that works is important. I think in doing the KPI, you have to have a meaningful measurement for the first 5 things that I listed. So you have to have a measurement of your culture, and there's lots of different ways to do that. And it's not, it's complex to measure what culture is actually doing. But how is your structure functioning? You can measure that. You can have a measurement of how your processes and systems are working, and how are you dealing with the external forces? And then you have to have that big, bold goal they talk about. And that's that purpose that everyone says, when we hit it, we know we won. And I think that's the important part, is defining what winning means for everybody on your team. And then when you do succeed, you acknowledge it and you celebrate it. I mean, that's the great thing about sports. You get to watch them. They win. You win a game. You win the championship. You celebrate. And we don't do that in business very well. And then it takes away the meaning. And if you win a big account, or you nailed a presentation, or you delivered a product to the customer that exceeded their expectations, that's a big win, and you need to be able to celebrate it. But you need to define what it really means in the first place.
Yeah, gosh, you are preaching to the choir here, because I love celebrating business wins. I think it's such an important thing. And I love that you drew that analogy, that comparison to sports, because you're right. There's no greater feeling in sports than scoring that goal and celebrating with all of your teammates. And you're right. If we starve ourselves of that in business, that's when it becomes monotonous. That's when it starts to feel like a grind. And Glenn, that's why I feel like, obviously I haven't seen you walk in and do your thing as far as you with your entrepreneur hat, but I would imagine that you are a breath of fresh air to the teams that you get to work with, because you bring that outside perspective and you remind them of these things that make us human. It's right there in your website, which is human maximization. Talk to us about that process, because it gives us as entrepreneurs, as business owners, as business leaders, if we're still in our 9-to-5 job, it's just a solid reminder for us that these things can change. Whether they're good or bad today has no bearing on what it can be in the future. So talk to us about the actual influence of change that you bring, because we're not talking about a small project of launching a new marketing campaign. You're talking about changing the inner workings of human teams inside of organizations. How do you go about that?
Yeah. Well, I think the first part is we do an assessment process that looks at all the pillars. So that creates a little bit of a roadmap. But everyone says that people don't like change. And that I don't believe that. It's they don't like change happening to them. When it happens with them and you move through the process and they get to have their say, then you don't get the resistance. Now, to say that you don't get any resistance would not be true. But I think that's really what it is people need to know what's in it for them as individuals, and as teams. So as an example, I used earlier that people get really tied to their workarounds around systems that aren't functioning really well. And we recently had a client a few days ago. We presented something to them, and we got resistance immediately because they wanted to be tied to their workarounds. Now, we have to understand that fact, and we have to also understand that everyone goes through the change process a little differently. We look at it as we treat it almost like a mourning process, in that you do mourn losing the old way. And so acknowledging that at the beginning and letting everybody know they got to go through this process individually, and we're okay with it, and teaching the leaders to be okay with that is really the key to it. And understanding that people will, we don't think a change process is over until everyone celebrates that it was a good thing. And it's hard to get 100%. We don't always, but that's our goal. And the reality is that you can get almost to celebrating, and someone can go all the way back to full resistance. And you have to acknowledge, like I said earlier, be curious as to why, what triggered them to do that, and then help them work their way through it. And I think that's the thing. It is the solutions are not complex, but getting to the final resolution is, because human beings are complex organisms, and so that makes the challenge.
Yeah, I love that perspective, because you're right in that all of us, I think we forget that the goalposts are to make 100% of people happy. That is that aspirational goal. It doesn't mean we're going to get there, but I love that attitude going into it, because why would we go into it for any other reason? So I love that perspective, Glenn. I want to switch gears a little bit as we come towards the end of our conversation here today. There's so much more I could ask you, but while I have you here on the air, I have to ask you about the future outlook, because from my perspective, workplaces, which is obviously what we're talking about here today, workplaces are changing so much post the pandemic, post, technology changing and enabling teams to grow in so many different ways. How many teams take place? How much corporate culture is shaped by Slack channels these days? Teams have all different shapes and sizes and geographic spreads in today's world. What's your perspective on the future of all of these aspects that we're talking about? Because at the end of the day, we're humans, whether we're remote teams or in-person teams, all of these things, these interpersonal things are always going to affect us. What's your take on where the workplace is headed, some trends that you like, some things to look out for, and maybe some opportunities with all of these changes that we've already seen?
Sure. I think the number one thing is we can never get away from the fact that we as human beings need connection. And that's what I think it was solidified in every way possible during the lockdown throughout the world. And if there was any doubt before that, there shouldn't be now. So in our remote world, and our team, I don't have a big team at this point, but we do a lot of remote work. We're spread out along the Northwest, and we have someone in Arizona. So we're learning how to connect and how to connect in the same room on occasion, to make sure that we communicate at a high level. As their leader, I'm paying attention to that and to how everybody's doing. That is one of those trends that doesn't change. It makes it more challenging. It makes it a little more part of your job than maybe it would be if you're in a cubicle area and you can walk through and see people. But I don't see this as 100% negative. A couple other trends are generational. People talk about the millennials and the Gen Z or whatever they're ultimately going to be labeled as problematic. And I don't think that's the case. I think they're going to change the world, and already are, especially the workplace, in a positive way, because they don't tolerate poor leadership. They don't tolerate poor culture, nor should they. But we, as the older generations, have been taught to do that, to tolerate it, to work our way through it, to tough it out. They don't. And I think they have a little bit of an activist vent to them, and I think that is a positive. So I think that trend is something that is, a lot of people see as negative. I don't. Kind of the final one I see is however, those generations don't come in with preset skills on how to be in a workplace like we did. I grew up in farm country, and I jumped on the farm, and I learned how to be in a workplace, and the farmer dictated, and you kind of learned how to work with people. They don't do that as much anymore, and that's not a negative or a positive. It just is. So when you bring them into a workplace, you have to prepare them. And I see that as an incredible opportunity for entrepreneurs as well as for businesses, is the ones who are going to bring them in and train them and get them ready to understand, how does HR work? How do I navigate the day-to-day work? How do I navigate a grumpy coworker and those sort of things? If you teach them that, then you will get the loyalty that you're talking about. Are they going to stay 30 years? Probably not. So you're going to have to understand how you get the most out of people in the time that they're there. And that's a change in how we operate. It's also an opportunity, to grow people. And as they move on, they take some of the stuff that you taught them, talk about it, and then you end up getting good employees on your team.
Yeah, Glenn, I'll tell you what, I want to call out two things for listeners right there. The first is how you pointed out, it's not a good thing. It's not a negative thing. It just is. I love that perspective on it so much. And the second thing that I really want to call out is when you talk about these changes, whether it's generational, I'm a fellow millennial, and so I know how much we are all changing the workplace. And yeah, you're right. Even as a millennial, looking back to the generation that's even younger than mine, the way that they're changing the workplace, I heard from someone recently who said that they're the first generation that money almost doesn't seem to move the needle for them whatsoever. They're so motivated by other forces. So Glenn, at the root, and this is the thing I want to call out, at the root of so much of your future looking perspectives is the fact that these things only get more important. Understanding motivators, understanding the individuals, tapping into the human element of things is only going to be more important, whether it's generational differences, technology, geographic differences, all of these things only get more important. So I love those insights, Glenn. And now I'm going to give you the tough task of the episode, as I love to do with all my guests, and that is to somehow sum up an actionable takeaway for listeners. We talked about all these different ingredients. Some of our listeners are going to feel the heat to say, I need to be more intentional and strategic about these 6 pillars that you shared with us here today. Some of them are wantrepreneurs who are still in their 9-to-5s, but looking to build those skills that they can take into entrepreneurship. So Glenn, with all those things in mind, what's something that you'd love for every listener to do from here after listening to us today?
Sure. I think a couple things. One is that I've learned through my life, and certainly as an entrepreneur, that I don't like to do everything, and I'm not good at everything. So create partnerships. I think that with people who love to do things you don't, and they're out there, right? Every one of us is given a reason to be here and a skill set to do that work. So I think that's one piece of it. The other is, as a leader or any member of a team, of a workplace, because that's what we focus on and I focus on. If you're a member of a workplace and you're struggling, you need to and you need help. We're low staffed. We're working on on thin margins, and there are people out there who can help you kind of get, like you said at the beginning, the outside looking in. You can't see the label from the inside. Those people can see those things. And yes, we would love to work with all of you, but we know we can't. And our mission is not to just have our business, but our mission is to change the world by changing the workplace. And so we want you to get help if you need it and you can't do it, not because you're not an expert, because you don't have time. Go get the help. Ask somebody. There are people out there, and there are a lot of great people out there doing similar work to this. And again, if you can learn something from our website or from our stuff and implement it on your own, awesome. We're very happy that you do that.
Yes, and I do want to add on to that. I want to give you a huge shout out, Glenn, because obviously, as I've been doing research about the work that you do, your website has been a huge help. Your website isn't just a brochure for your business. Your website literally walks people through the framework that you shared with us here today. You have assessment tools right there on your website. So I've obviously teased your website a little bit here throughout today's episode. I know listeners are going to be keen to check it out. So Glenn, the stage is yours. Don't be shy. Tell listeners where they can go to learn more about what you're doing as far as changing the workplace, how they can follow you, and all the great tools that you offer for everybody.
Okay, well, that website's akramoff.com, and we did that intentionally. And if you have suggestions for us as you're looking at it, you need more stuff, awesome. We take those and implement them all the time. You can find us on LinkedIn. We post regularly and on some of the stuff we're working on and concepts that we've come up with. You can find us. We have some videos out on YouTube. We're on Twitter or X, I guess it is now. And I also want to highlight. I don't talk about it a ton, but if you want to get into the details and the story behind how each of those pillars and also the 8 keys that we have for building a successful team, I do have a book out there. It's on Amazon. It's called The Human-Centered Team, and you can find it at humancenteredbook.com.
Yes, Glenn, I love that overview because it just goes to show. Obviously, you brought so much of this energy here in our session today. You're so generous with your experiences, your insights, your strategies, your perspectives, and we so appreciate that. So listeners, we're linking to all of those amazing resources that Glenn just mentioned down below, including his book, his website. There's also, I didn't even mention, you've got amazing blog posts on your website. So just a wealth of content that people can lean into as well as connect with you personally. So I so appreciate that. Listeners, check out those links wherever it is that you're tuning in. Otherwise, Glenn, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thank you very much.